Good morning. You're very welcome. James introduced me, but I'll just, in case anybody has just joined, let me reintroduce myself. My name's Kerry Thomas. I'm one of the editors here at Tortoise. Great pleasure to be here and looking forward to this conversation over the next hour or so with some great guests, but crucially, as you saw in the last session, as much as we possibly can from people in the room to help us understand their point of view, their experience, their hopes, their fears. These things really work when as many people as possible join in. So do join in the chat. Do join in. We'll look out for you in the chat. If you want to come into the main conversation, put your hand up, but we won't be passive about it. We'll look out for interesting points in the chat and try and pull people into the main conversation from there as well. So for the next hour, we're going to talk about whether we can find a cure for Alzheimer's. And I think of all the great global health challenges that we're going to talk about today, not many feel quite as tantalizing as dementia. I'll come back to that word, but I think half of all of us who live beyond the age of 85 are likely to experience it. So the scale is vast, but in a sense, the response seems strangely half-hearted. And the reason I say that is because there's not nearly the same intensity of focus on dementia as there is on cancer, for example. There's not nearly as much money invested in looking for a cure. And so it feels as if our state of knowledge of a disease like Alzheimer's is stuck in a place where something like cancer was 20 years ago. It's still, for many people, and it certainly would be for me, I think, a terrifying diagnosis to receive, and too often a stigmatizing one as well. So the reason I say it's a tantalizing challenge is because I think you could take the view that we haven't really tested yet what we could achieve with Alzheimer's if we really put our minds to it and our money behind it. Now, except that's a very royal we, because I certainly wouldn't want to apply it to our expert guests today. These are some big names in the world of Alzheimer's research, and I'm really grateful to all of them for giving us the time today to help us get our heads around this. And I should say thanks to Scottish Widows for their support for all these thinkings that are happening today. So we've got a renowned researcher, we've got a renowned advocate, we've got a major funder to talk to. The renowned researcher is Professor Bart de Stroper, who's director of the UK Dementia Research Institute. I'll come to you shortly, Bart. We've got a renowned advocate in the shape of Paolo Barberino, who's the chief executive of Alzheimer's Disease International. And the big funder is Dr. Richard Oakley, who's head of research at the Alzheimer's Society. And Richard, because I've introduced you last, let me just come to you briefly first, because from my layman's point of view, I guess the two most promising lines of inquiry into Alzheimer's seem to focus on a couple of proteins. So I guess I should say what I'd like to do first is just try and establish the sort of current state of understanding and research. So the two most promising lines of inquiry seem to focus on a couple of proteins, one called amyloid and the other called tau. Can you do that impossible thing and try to explain to me in a way that I can understand what those two proteins are and what roles we think they might have in Alzheimer's? I'd just like to have a sense, I think, of where the science is right now. I think Richard is clearly muted. Let's try and sort
Sorry, my computer's having a little bit of a heart attack here, so hopefully I can get through. So yeah, amyloid beta and tau are two of the molecules that kind of we're talking about most, and just bring it back a little bit to basics. So we have something called they're called the amino acids, and they're kind of the building blocks for everything in our body, really. And when you get groups of these or chains of these together, they can form things called peptides, or these are the molecules that make things happen in your body. So they bring other molecules together, they send molecules away, they basically do all the doing, or they facilitate all the doing of everything in your body. So they're really, really important. And so one of these molecules is a protein called tau, and we all have it in our bodies when we're healthy. This isn't just for people with Alzheimer's disease, and it plays a really important role, and it basically stabilizes your cells. It does a couple of different things, but it basically makes sure our cells stable, and it does that via a couple of different ways, but it plays a really important role. And the same with amyloid beta. It's a peptide, just a smaller grouping of these amino acids. And it plays, again, really important roles in our bodies. We all have it, and it does things like trafficking, so it moves molecules around our bodies. And like I say, I think it's really important just to note we all have them. We all have these two molecules, these proteins in our bodies. What happens in Alzheimer's disease is essentially our body has an equilibrium, and when we don't have enough of a molecule, it can produce more, and when it has too much, we clear it away and we break it down. And in Alzheimer's disease, these two molecules essentially they coagulate, they group together, and they start forming it. In amyloid beta case, we form something we call plaques, and with tau we call fibrils. And these are basically just groupings of these molecules that come together, and they start causing damage to the neurons in our brains. And the neurons, if you consider the brain to be a computer, is kind of the wiring. It allows the electricity to be passed around, and just really simply, it causes damages to these neurons. And then that stops our brains being able to function in the way we want to. And that is a really simple, really dirty analogy in that sense, but I think it's just really important to say we all have them, and what happens is they group together and they start causing damage, and our body isn't able to remove them in the way that it can do for healthy individuals.
Richard, thank you. That's exactly what I wanted. And am I right to say that those are the two major lines of inquiry in Alzheimer's research at the moment?
I think they're probably the two most well known, and I think that's slightly different. So I think we've known a lot about them. There's been a lot of interest in them, and certainly Alzheimer's Society, we funded the first study that kind of recognised and came up with this idea of this amyloid hypothesis, which is the amyloid beta starts everything essentially in the process. But I think where we've got to now is, as is often the case in these very complicated diseases, there's probably not one answer, there's not one cause, there's not one thing going on. I think that's where we've got to now. There are going to be multiple things going on, and that's probably why we haven't made as much progress. We identified amyloid as a problem. We've actually created drugs which we showed can clear amyloid, and we didn't see the benefits. And I think that's because while amyloid and tau are clearly major players and they're very well known, there are other things going on that my esteemed colleagues on the call today are ones that are finding out what the other things, or what the other major players are, what the other major molecules are. But amyloid and tau are the most well known, and probably they're the most that's been researched, but there are absolutely others.
Okay, Richard, that's great. That's really helpful. Bart, can I come to you? I think, if I'm correct, that the major sort of focus of your research has been on amyloids.
Yes.
Can you, again, I'm just trying to understand the sort of state of play now, what we think we understand now. Can you perhaps just sort of paint a picture of what we know now that we didn't know 10 years ago? Where have you seen progress?
Yes, so I think Richard gives really the way we were thinking about Alzheimer's disease up to 2016. He clearly announced that we have now a much more complete view, or start to try to get a more complete view on the disease, where several processes happen in parallel. And so I think the most important thing is that there are two big confusions in the field which has hampered drug development. And the first is that we equal Alzheimer's disease to dementia, while dementia is a symptom and is an end stage of the disease, and basically reflects that your brain is very dysfunctional and that you have probably lost already a lot of neurons. And then Alzheimer's disease is, in my opinion, a disease which is characterized by these protein accumulations, which Richard just described to you. But these accumulations are present in the brain 20 to 30 years before you get into that stage of dementia, which is the clinical phase. And so in 2016, I wrote a big review on this, and saying, look, if we continue thinking like amyloid is causing dementia, then we are never going to get anywhere. And so we defined a cellular phase conceptually in the brain, where we said this amyloid is triggering reactions of the different cell types in the brain. And it's not only the neurons, which are of course which is of course the computer of the system. It's not only the neurons which are important, but also the other cell types there. And so this has brought in the concept of inflammation, neuroinflammation. There are a couple of cells in the brain responsible for defense reactions, and they get intermingled in this disease, and they probably respond to these amyloid plaques and these neuronal tangles or fibrils. And this response is crucial.
Let me just jump in there, Bart, for a second, just to make sure I'm understanding things. So amyloids cause inflammation. That's a hypothesis. That the inflammation causes a response, and the response is what causes the damage to the brain. Is that the sort of chain that you have? Yeah.
It's probably even more complicated because it's possible that these cells transform these proteins into toxic substances. So but let's, for the sake of discussion, say indeed there is a cellular component which then affects your brain cells. And if this, it's basically how is your brain dealing with these lesions, which makes whether you go in the course of dementia or whether you keep well, even with the presence of these lesions.
Yeah, and how much of what you just described have you learned in the last 5 or 10 years, and how much goes back further than that?
Well, I mean, I think the insight that this is really from the last years. But then if you go back, like with all good research, and you go back to older papers and older publications, you start to realize that some people have been thinking about that already, but it was not mainstream at those times. So that's the fantastic thing of research, that there is so much going on in parallel, and it's with waves. So it's waves of insights, and which pushes then the field forward again. So in the 20 years ago, I was at the revolution when this amyloid and tau hypothesis got formulated, and the insight was there that some of the rare genetic forms of Alzheimer's disease affect precisely those proteins. So we know that a mutation in these people, a simple letter change in the billion of letters you have in your genome, was sufficient to get the full spectrum of Alzheimer's disease. And these codes were in the code for the amyloid precursor protein, so the protein which makes the A beta peptide. So that has been a real revolution in the field and has really exploded drug development, and explains basically the focus until now on this amyloid and the tau peptides for drug development. And so now we have this new insight, which comes from genetics and from cell biology experiments, which tells us the cellular response is important. And we see now a real shift in the efforts to make drugs now to the cellular phase, while these other therapies are still under development. Because I think one of the reasons we are sitting together here is that there is some smoke. Everybody is saying the amyloid therapies are not working, but there are at least 2 or 3 hints now in the clinic that if you use them in the right way, that they are going to do something beneficial. So it's really an exciting time.
And but if I've understood you correctly, obviously there are multiple causes of Alzheimer's and dementia, and I think one of the things we're going to have to grapple with here is the complexity of it all. But at the same time, you have been able, I think, or others have been able to identify a single mutation in a gene, that one letter in all our genetic code that always causes dementia. Is that right?
Yes, that's basically, that's where we are. But so I think conceptually, people think this is all very novel, but cancer is really a very nice correlation. With cancer, if I remember, there was all about oncogenes, cancer genes. That was when cancer research started, basically, and became modern. And so nobody's working, well, of course, everybody's working on cancer genes, but nobody's thinking anymore in that terms. Everybody's thinking about the cellular niche and the interactions of different cells and how the immune system fights against cancer. Everybody has cancer, but some people get real full cancer with metastases and everything, and other people just cure and go on. So what makes the body taking care of it? And so that type of thinking, which is already mainstream 15 years in the cancer field, has finally reached our field. Of course, mutatis mutandis, we are talking about protein accumulations. In the cancer, you're really talking about cell growth. But we know now that the immune system is important, that the vascular system is important. And that's also going to change the way we think about therapies. Because in cancer, nobody is surprised that you have different therapies at different stages of the disease. And in cancer, nobody is amazed that you treat patients who have no symptoms to prevent the symptoms. So in Alzheimer's, we are finally at that stage where we think that it might be useful to treat patients before they have dementia, and that Alzheimer's starts already before dementia is there, and that there are genetic causes and environmental causes. and that it's probably good to keep your blood vessels okay in the brain. That's probably going to protect you. And there might be something like a statin, which we take to avoid cardiovascular disease. Maybe we could develop a similar drug in Alzheimer's field. I mean, everything is changing at the moment.
Yeah, brilliant. Bart, thank you. I'll come back to you certainly. Paola Barberino from Alzheimer's Disease International. Thanks so much for joining us. Can I stay on this same question before we sort of cast forward and address the question of a cure? Can you just help me understand a bit more about where you think we are now? As Bart says, that comparison with cancer feels quite sort of enticing. If you take that as your comparison, how would you characterize the state of research and knowledge into Alzheimer's now compared with where we stand on cancer?
Well, I mean, Alzheimer's disease and dementia have been the subject of great stigma, of great difficulty in talking about it now for over a century. So if you think that cancer and Alzheimer's disease were discovered pretty much at the same time, is quite telling, is quite amazing that whilst the International Union for Cancer Control was founded in the first half of the 20th century, an organization like Alzheimer's Disease International, which is the international body that advocates for Alzheimer's and dementia in places like the World Health Organization, was only founded in the 80s. And that really is reflective of the fact that people didn't want to talk about Alzheimer's and dementia, that people who had Alzheimer's and dementia were effectively hidden from society. And this immediately tells you why we are so late with research. I mean, a funding organization like Richard's, funding organizations like the Alzheimer's Association in America have been working very, very hard, but all of that in only the last 5 decades. So we are late. We are late to the research issue, and so we just need to speed up. A lot of what Bart says was gold. You know, at the moment, actually, I think we are in a fantastic time of acknowledging, of understanding, of self-analysis of why we are so late, and of the incredible amount of opportunity ahead of us if we only really seize this opportunity. Now, for example, we are at the moment in a very difficult time. There is a pandemic, etc. But what COVID-19 has taught us is that when the world does get together, when you're looking globally at what is happening, and also, as Bart was pointing out, diachronically, so there is a synchronic element of us all looking together at the same time about what's happening, but also historically of what has already been researched. And if we really pull together and we have sufficient funding to do that, we really could make massive advances in the field of Alzheimer's and dementia. But you can see that a lot of the obstacles that have now been removed, you know, a lot of companies now talk about how much red tape has been removed during the COVID-19 element to make things faster. A lot of the things that are dragging us down, that are slowing us down, are actually to do with politics, with regulation, with the unwillingness to get stuff done together, and also to a certain extent the reserve for certain organizations to work together. This is why the institute that Bart leads, it's an important institute because it's a collaboration. We at ADI only works with collaborative global projects, and there are few and far between. But when you really do get a collaborative global project, the impact is fantastic. Think about what Finland is doing in the field of prevention, risk reduction, which also Bart mentioned. So the looking at what may be protective factors, things that we can do before we even develop this disease. A lot of it has to do with policy. Actually, a lot of it has to do with public health. And still not in the UK, but in many governments that I speak to around the world, there is denial that Alzheimer's and dementia even exist in their country. And the awareness issue is still the single bigger factor that prevents us from having hope, you know, from actually getting to the point that we'll find a solution.
And Paola, I'm fascinated by why you think we got going so late on Alzheimer's. Why did we get going 50 years after we got going on cancer? Is that to do with stigma? What's going on there, do you think?
Well, I personally think so. I still remember when back in the 70s, my grandfather got cancer, and in the family, we didn't even mention the word. The word was not something you talked about. And you can easily see that with dementia, with Alzheimer's, that has been the same. Much more recently, up until the late 90s, the early 2000s, still there was a reluctance in many higher income countries. Let's not get me started on lower income countries to even talk about it. In some lower income countries, people who have dementia suffer all kinds of very difficult positions, from being locked inside houses to being physically, restrained. I mean, some of the stuff that happens is awful. But think about a country like Japan, which instead is very advanced and in a way is one of the countries that has first tackled this. They had to change the word for dementia formally at governmental level because it was so derogatory, and such an enormous amount of their population had the disease. They actually changed it to a word that is not derogatory by decree, which is incredible if you think about it.
They actually, just to be clear, they changed the law, didn't they, to stop people using the old derogatory word for dementia?
So they had to change this law, this word. It became not legal anymore to use this particular word. And in many countries, I mean, I go and advocate in many languages and in many countries. And in some countries, the first thing they tell me when I climb on a podium is, whatever you do, don't use the word dementia, because that is really bad. And this is in part why people then get confused. I mean, Bart explained it beautifully, as did Richard. Dementia is the end point of a number of things that actually lead you to dementia. So you have, at the moment, I mean, God knows how many more there are, 104 ways to get to dementia, and Alzheimer's disease is the one that is the most prevalent. But you've got a lot of ways of getting there. And a lot of countries use this word dementia in a really not very nice context. So each country then has adopted a different way because the label is more palatable. So to an extent, my organization, Alzheimer's Disease International, should really be Alzheimer and Dementia International. But we were called Alzheimer's disease because when we were founded in the 80s, that was more acceptable. It's a label that is less scary, if you wish, than the label dementia.
Yeah. Okay, listen, I want to turn our attention a little bit to the question of diagnostics, diagnosing Alzheimer's, when we can do that and how important it is to be able to do that early. I'm going to just bring in, I saw Jade Seidman making an interesting point in the chat about the link between diagnostics and the commitment to research. Jade, do you see a link between those two things?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much for this discussion. It's so interesting. I did my undergraduate at King's College in neuroscience, and I'm currently doing a master's in public health. So this is a really interesting topic for me. I think Paola really touched on this, which is this idea of this shift from dementia being a cultural thing to becoming more the forefront of science, which is maybe when we make this comparison I see with cancer, cancer has always, and from what I understand, been approached more from a research, from a scientific point of view, whereas dementia has really started out with this kind of cultural stigma and many different cultures understanding it in a different way. And I think maybe that's been a little bit of a hindrance in history over time as to how we've approached dementia. I could almost see, potentially, and I'd be interested in seeing whether the panelists, what they think about this, seeing that we see dementia as being an end stage thing that comes out after kind of we've seen the end stages of the causes that we've seen in the brain, whether we, after the age of 85, maybe should be more active about maybe having more active screenings, more active MRIs to see whether we can see these changes in the brain before we reach the stages of dementia. And then that would in turn maybe help us to be able to monitor patients who have early stage dementia, and then therefore be able to help find treatments. Because once we reach later stage dementia, it's hard to turn that back.
Great. I can see, Jed, I can see Bart nodding as you were talking. So I think we're going to get some agreement here. But you set us off down a really interesting path there. So let me just take a first step down it with Richard, if I can come, Richard Oakley, just come back to you on that. On the question of diagnosis, again, if I could just ask you to help us understand where are we at the moment on diagnosis? How early? What progress have we made on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, very quickly, just before the comparisons to cancer. So I worked in cancer for nearly a decade before this, and I think they're really interesting. I think one of the biggest things is Richard Nixon, the US government declared war on cancer in the 70s, and that funding went into really basic biology, basic understanding. And from that understanding, that knowledge, you can break down stigma. And that underpinned a whole range of research across the world, really, even building some of those advances. So I think that's, for me, one of the biggest differences. And I think the early section...
You go on to diagnosis. I suppose one of the things that interests me about that is whether you can break down stigma without effective treatment. And it sounds as if you think you can, that research can break down stigma without being able to say we can do it effectively.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think so. I'm biased in that because I did a PhD in the postdoc, so I'm interested in basic biology, basic research. I think knowledge is power. And I think what the kind of underpinning funding from the US did is it enabled people to ask those basic biology questions, to understand what is happening. And that then leads to all the other advances. So we now have 2 in 4 people surviving cancer, and it was 1 in 4 in the 70s. And it didn't come from one drug or one development. It came from many generations of researchers adding knowledge on understanding. As Bart rightly said, we've gone from oncogenes to understand the immunotherapy plays a role, and that's 5 years ago. So I think there's a huge amount to say in that. And I think in the early diagnosis, again, there's a really great comparison. We now have in the UK, we have 3 national screening programs where we are detecting people and we can identify which people are going to get which cancers earlier, and we screen them earlier and we go through it. And I think we're quite a long way from that right now in dementia. I mean, so that scientifically speaking, we can detect now changes in people's brains 20 years before the onset of symptoms. That is what we can do scientifically. We are not, of course, actioning that in a public health space, and Paolo mentioned the public health angle, which is absolutely vital. So I think one thing is, can we get to the stage where we are able to roll out programs where we can detect that? Would people even then engage with them, or would they still have this stigma? You need to tackle that stigma along with the basic biology, along with the technologies and the public health angle. I think where we are now is we are now having these discussions, which is absolutely fantastic. We are talking about dementia. We're talking about early diagnosis. We're talking about the basic biology that we need to understand more. And we are getting treatments into the end stage of clinical trials. They're not getting there yet, but we're learning from that. So I think we understand from a research point of view more than we ever have. And I think that together with technology and the biomarkers, and I'm sure we'll talk about blood-based biomarkers in a second, we're getting to the stage now where we understand these things and the technologies working together, the biology. I think that stigma and that public health message and that implementation, I think that's a great challenge that we're going to be getting to now.
Yeah, Bart, let me come back to you on this, and let me sort of take myself as your patient in this respect. So I'm, in my late 50s. I'm looking at generations older than me in my family, and over the last several years, there's been a prevalence of dementia that's been, a new thing, because people in their early mid 80s, and I'm seeing it extensively within the sort of extended family now. Do you foresee a future where you could run a test on me and tell me now that I have the early stages of dementia? And then I want to bring in Jodie Parslow from the chat, because she's been making some interesting points about whether that's an ethical thing to do. But talk me through what you could do for me now if I wanted to have that done.
Well, there is, of course, what we can do now and what we could do in the future. And before I fully address your question, I just want to make another analogy with AIDS, where there was also a taboo, and it's the research which has taken away the taboo. And it's then the public who has forced the researchers to make therapies, because all of a sudden they realized it's a disease. And so I think that's a mechanism which to my happiness, is occurring at the moment. So we understand now that Alzheimer's is a disease, and the public starts to feel, okay, if it's a disease, then you should find a therapy. And we start to see this will emanated in the political decisions, and we see also increasing pressure on companies to do a little bit more than just wait and see where they can make profit and anticipate in development. So I just want to make these analogies. So then for your concrete questions and diagnosis, so at the moment we don't have a therapy which is really going to help you. And so that makes, of course, that the early diagnosis and the things I'm saying are things which happen in research situations, because everybody anticipates in the field that we will have to treat patients like you potentially at the moment that they are still completely healthy and cognitive normal, because that's the best treatment. Prevention is the best treatment. So can we do that already? I think, and if we would increase the effort, we would certainly be able to do that. We can already image the lesions which we are talking about, which was impossible 5 years ago, I must say. But now we can, with reasonable sensitivity, see these lesions accumulating in your brain, even if you have no cognitive symptoms. So that's one thing. The other thing, which is a little bit things, the iceberg, the part of the iceberg you don't see, and many people try to ignore it because people like environmental factors to cause disease. You see that also in the cancer, but they forget that a lot of what happens in your life is based on your genetics. And so for Alzheimer's disease, even if it's an old age disease, we know that between 50 and 70% of your risk is in your body. And similar, I mean, it's, so what we could do also, and what we will do, and which will create a lot of ethical issues, but it will be true for other diseases too, we will make a genetic card of everybody. We will sequence you, and we will tell you based on that sequence what type of diseases you are highly likely to get. And so what we will see in the future is that somebody like you would have from its genetics known that you have to watch a little bit more your risk for dementia. And so then you will have some low-based functional screenings of your cognition at your 40 or 50 to make a baseline, probably something you do on your computer, probably something which your general practitioner is going to ask you to do. And then 5 or 10 years later, the same assay will be done. And there will be maybe some signs that your brain is working less efficiently than it should. Yeah. And then you will go into the hospital for a full workup where this imaging, very expensive imaging, will be done. And I hope that at that time, and that's probably the topic you want to discuss further on, that at that time we have also the therapies to help you and to prevent the further development. So that's my view on this.
Yeah, but I guess I'm slightly less cheerful because you said that the weight of the genetic factors is so high. Because if you'd said to me that environmental factors were 70% of the risk, then I might have thought, well, if I exercise and I change my diet, then I can influence those. But actually, you influence those things are relatively small compared to the genetics.
I mean, that's the problem with people. It's a problem which comes everywhere. So I am sure that if you keep your cardiovascular system, and there is proof that you can, if you keep your cardiovascular system okay, that you will postpone your dementia, that you will lower your risk basically to get dementia at a certain age. But I'm using now the word dementia, which has not been shown, is that you can prevent Alzheimer's disease because you probably prevent vascular dementia, or you prevent the vascular component in your dementia. And you have to imagine dementia is an old age disorder. So it's probably a mix of different mechanisms and causes in many cases. So it makes always sense to keep your cardiovascular system in check. And that's a lot environment, training, food, etc. It makes a lot of sense also for dementia. So you cannot be fatalistic and say, I have bad genes, I cannot do anything. That's one thing. The other thing is that people, this part of the taboo we need to overcome, because in cancer, there are genetic cancers, and people know that and are happy to know that because they are screened, for instance, for intestinal tumors. These people, or for ovarian cancers, these people are screened from their 40 and even earlier on. And as soon as there is a sign of the cancer, there is a very severe intervention, but then these people are helped. And so why wouldn't that be true for dementia? Well, we don't dare to think about it because dementia is a taboo. That's something which happens in your brain. That's something with your soul. And it's something which you don't, it's impossible that by simply surgery, you could do something.
Yeah.
While I'm predicting that you can intervene with it.
Let me just bring in Jodie Parslow, because Jodie, I think you haven't got a camera, but you were making some interesting points in the chat about the wisdom of diagnosis or the ethics of diagnosis without effective treatment. Are you there, Jodie?
Yes, I am. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, lovely. What do you think about all this?
So a little bit where I'm coming from with my background. So I actually worked as a nursing assistant with dementia patients, first of all, alongside my A-levels and my undergrad. My undergraduate's in medical neuroscience. I then had a master's in neuroscience, and I'm now doing my PhD at King's College London. And I'm actually looking at exactly as Bart kind of talked about, the protein aggregate story, all the way from this cellular component and then through to neuroinflammation and how that kind of interacts with each other. So I think it's, it's a really exciting time to be in this area of research, but as you said, we're still, I like the comparison with cancer in the way that I know from talking to family and friends, so a lot of my family are not from an academic background, so they don't understand a lot of what I do, but seeing from like the understanding of the general public, people understand that if you find the cancer earlier, you're increasing your chances of survival. That's just something that people intuitively understand. But I think a couple of people in the chat said the same thing, that I think people's mentality is, what's the point in finding out that I have this sort of death sentence, if you like, 20 years in advance? I mean, just to kind of give me anxiety that is coming, when we can't offer anything kind of practical to go with that. So I do think it's this balance between early diagnosis, but then practically what can we be seen to be doing for those patients? And I think there was the kind of humanity and the social aspect. So from working as a nurse, there are memory-based games, cognitive games, there are things that you can do that improve symptoms, but importantly, you are treating the symptoms. You are not treating the biology, the causation that's in the brain. And I think that there's this real kind of confusion between the terms dementia, which importantly are the symptoms. It's characterized by this loss of memory as well as other cognitive problems, and then the disease, and they're two separate things. And Alzheimer's is obviously what the most common cause and people know about, but there are many others, and I think someone mentioned Lewy body. So it's knowing where these diseases all kind of overlap, so that we can try and treat as many things in one hit as possible, and that's what my PhD is kind of centered around. Okay,
so Jodie, does that mean you sort of look for, I'll come to you in a second, Paola, does that mean you look forward to a day when we might openly talk about stage 1 Alzheimer's, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, as we do about cancer?
Yes, exactly, yes, so that people can understand and visualize the kind of how linear this disease is, because I think it's this kind of unknown, and people will wait to go to their doctor because they don't know what's normal aging, being forgetful, and what is abnormal and needs attention. And I think it's a mix. The stigma's still there, but the stigma's changed. And so the stigma's gone from, this is a normal part of aging, I'm senile, that sort of terminology, and is now shifted to, oh, okay, this is abnormal, but I'm too embarrassed to kind of do anything about it because I know what this means for me. And so I think there is a political and social aspect, but obviously that needs to be teamed with the research.
Okay, I want to turn our attention in a minute to the question of funding and research and what we need to do to have a war on Alzheimer's to match the war on cancer. But Paola, I think you wanted to come in just now.
Yes, because I've seen the chat line, many questions around this, and I just wanted to clarify something. We did a World Alzheimer report on awareness and stigma in 2019. We interviewed 70,000 people in 128 countries. And there were two findings that were seriously shocking. One was that 62% of healthcare practitioners globally, so this is doctors and nurses, believe that dementia is just a normal part of aging. So they would just ignore it as a diagnosis. So if people continue to think about this, and this is healthcare practitioners who are not trained, there was a report by the OECD in 2017 that explained that only 12 hours of training were given to any healthcare professional in OECD, in higher income countries, for training of dementia. So it's not surprising that a lot of doctors and nurses just don't think dementia is a disease. And so this is one big point of stigma. The second thing that may interest you, that we also ask the people generally whether, and this included a big proportion of people living with dementia, whether they would take a genetic test to ascertain whether they had dementia. And 70% say that even if there was no cure, they would take a genetic test. They want to know. And this again reflects my experience of going all over the world. People want to know. Indeed, I was in Argentina 2 years ago, where a group of kids in their late teens, early 20s, had been part of a genetic study because of their families having dementia. And I was shocked. I was actually in tears hearing them wanting to know that they could develop it. But they wanted to know. So, we cannot presume that the opinions of other people. If people want to know, then that's how it is. And it's important because also the families at times want to know, because there is a lot that you can do, even in the absence of a cure, to provide better care, to make sure that a family as well has a path. And this year, World Alzheimer report will be on diagnosis, and the year after is going to be on post-diagnostic support, because with these groundbreaking therapies now on the horizon, the issue of diagnostic is becoming massive. In many countries, there are no people that can do diagnostics. There are no geriatricians or neurologists or MRI scans or PET scans or CSF capacity. There's nothing. And in England, even, friends of mine, I live in London, friends that have parents in the countryside, for many of them, it's difficult to get a diagnosis because they're not in London, or in a city. So these are big issues, and they need to be resolved at political level globally, and then a local level, because of course change happens locally. But we cannot presume that people don't want to be tested. That's it. Thank you.
Paola, thank you. Richard, let me come back to you, because I was really interested in making that point earlier on about how the beginning of destigmatizing is research. So can you just, as you said that you moved from cancer research to Alzheimer's research, can you just do me a sort of compare and contrast? How much do we underinvest in Alzheimer's? Is there a quality problem with some of the research in Alzheimer's that you don't see in cancer? What's the landscape?
I love the way you say it's a problem in funding, and Bart absolutely starts nodding his head. So yeah, I think the comparison is really interesting about the stigma. I mean, a couple of people put in the chat around this in the stigma on cancer, and I have to acknowledge there absolutely is. I think what we're trying to say is we've come a long way from the 60s and 70s when you couldn't say the word to now we are talking about it, but that doesn't mean we've got all the way. So I acknowledge that. There's a mess. I think that the stat is, I think it's for every pound spent every pound spent in dementia, there's 6 spent on cancer. And I think knowledge is power, and I think if we did see that investment historically, we did see that understanding going forward, we would get to a better place in dementia in terms of our understanding of what the options are. I mean, Paola rightly said, we don't have a treatment right now, but there are interventions we can do. And someone correctly says, well, I think it was Jodie, about masking symptoms. We can't cure or tackle the underlying disease, but we can mask the symptoms, and that increases someone's quality of life. And that is a really important thing that we can do now. And early diagnosis enables us a better chance to do that. And I think the other thing to say is when treatments do come along, the earlier we are able to administer them, the better. We don't want to get a treatment and then we're doing it too late to help people. So we need to do things in tandem. I think the funding is absolutely an issue. I think where we've got to in the last kind of 10 years is we now have a really great pool of talented researchers that have really great technologies and tools at their disposal to do some really great research. And I think 30, 40 years ago, we didn't have that at the right levels and the right numbers. And I think we're obviously behind cancer, but it almost becomes a chain reaction. You get really great people with really great tools. They do really great research. Other researchers want to do it. Other researchers will take that baton on and do more, but you need to reach a critical mass. And I think we're there in dementia now. And I think that's scientifically, it's so exciting to see the progress. And it's one of the reasons I wanted to move into the dementia field. I was part of that shift in cancer, and I want to be part of that shift in dementia. I think the one thing to say is the pandemic has had a big effect, and biomedical charities in the UK make up a huge part of the landscape, and we're 40% down on our income, and that will affect the amount of research and the amount of people we can fund. And so I think it's been an amazing, exciting explosion in dementia research, hopefully in the last decade, and I think we just want to do everything we can to make sure that momentum is continued.
And Richard, what's caused that drop, the 40% drop?
So we haven't been able to do, mostly it's been able to do activities and getting people to do, in Alzheimer's Society, we do a memory walk, and it raises millions. And to be honest, we basically run a process whereby we give that money to the best researchers to do the best research they possibly can. And that's kind of how we do it. And unfortunately, we haven't been able to fundraise because people have been restricted to their houses. It's not just us, it's others as well. And I think what we need to do is just encourage people that when you are able to, your local charity, please do volunteer, help out. It makes such a difference whether you're raising money or just raising awareness and talking and volunteering. It's so important, particularly in the UK. Our biomedical charities play such a vital role supporting the government to do this research. And I guess that would be my request.
Yeah. Bart, are you still a bit jealous of cancer researchers?
Well, I'm in general an optimist, very positive thinking. I think that's what the researcher should do. But funding-wise, I'm director of Dementia Research Institute here. I started 3 years ago with big hope. We have attracted best people of the world to work together with us and with UK scientists in the different universities. And we had this leading role and expectations. And so we are 3 years further, and the COVID crisis comes, and many of us have suffered, but you have to see a growing institute. And we were basically cut more than 30 or 40% of our budget. And I'm really at this moment in a deep crisis, having promised to all these people, these young people joining me in the effort to treat and to cure and to do these things. And now all of a sudden, this money doesn't flow anymore. And I'm hearing about dementia moonshot, and I'm hearing about Alzheimer's Society doing all these efforts, but I'm concretely confronted with how long can I keep the people which I recruited in the institute working, etc. So if people say that this gap is closing, I'm not so sure, and I have some numbers here too. So there are about, the government invests in the UK at this moment 270 million pounds in cancer research, and they do, and this is one of the countries which invest most in dementia research, and that's 83 million, so that's still a big difference. And then you have to know that the number of patients in the world is 48 million people with dementia and 45 million people with cancer, so the problem is equal, so there should be equal investment. And so if you think about the number of researchers in the UK, there are 6,100 on dementia, which is a good group, but there are 26,300 on cancer. So, I mean, the gap is filling, but there is really huge effort needed. And in particular for my institute, I need urgently some help from the government to keep the rocket they were making, and they are talking about a moonshot. So they helped me, or I helped them making a rocket to go to the moon, but now the fuel is taken away. So there is something, I'm going to stop about this, but the funding is really a problem.
Yeah, that's incredibly important. But I've committed the unforgivable crime of taking my eye off the clock. I've got wrapped up in this and I haven't seen the time passing. So we are racing against the clock now in the final few minutes here. And I realize we haven't directly addressed the question I think we've sort of noodled around it interestingly. But so let me just go through all of you, because I think one of the striking things about, you know, Bart, Paola, Richard, is actually you're all incredibly optimistic in spite of, you know, some sort of high profile failures in treatments that have been experimented upon. So let me just put that question directly to you, Bart. Can we find a cure for Alzheimer's? Bart, let me just get the microphone on.
So I will be very brief. Yes, we will find something, and it's all a question of what we did until now is doing all these experiments in consecutive sections. So after each other, we need to do the experiments in parallel. And so for cancer, there are 2,900 trials. For Alzheimer's, dementia, there were 216 trials in the UK. So you see the effort, but there is so much hope now. So even the amyloid therapies, which we thought were completely off scale, I have 3 antibodies at this moment, which have shown positive signals in clinical trials. So we still need to find out what's the right moment to use it. But there is smoke from 3 independent antibodies that it could help. So I've never been in that situation during the 25 years I've been in the field. There is really going to be a cure.
Paola, can we crack this?
Well, I am terribly hopeful at the moment. There are therapeutics in progress in everything, in tau, in amyloid, in other areas, in nutrition. There's this fantastic movement around prevention. I am super hopeful. I really do think that we are on the cusp of something. My worry is of 2 types. One, what we are experiencing now may withdraw funding. And as Bart says, then we lose a generation of young researchers, of people that may be interested in developing this, and also we lose the momentum. The second is the funding for effectively, you know, the people to access this therapeutic. Some of these medications is going to be very expensive. One of them at the moment is going to the Food and Drug Administration. It's been filed with EMA in Europe and with Japan. So we are in a position now that we actually could see this not being given to people because it's going to be very, very expensive. So one of my worries is, can we then access it globally? Can everybody in the world have this possibility, this chance for hope?
Okay. Richard?
Yes, absolutely. We will find a cure. I mean, it's a simple answer to a complicated question, but I think we'll absolutely find cures. Of that is no doubt. I mean, many other diseases, you put the time, you put the effort, you put the research in, and you will find cures. I think what we won't see is one tablet that will cure all the various subtypes of dementia. I think we'll see it in the steps and stages. What I'd like to see sooner rather than later is, I think one of the steps onto a cure will be making dementia chronic. A disease where if you catch it early enough and you take a treatment that slows it down to the point where it doesn't affect your life. I mean, HIV, Bart mentioned, is a really great example. If you have access to the drugs, which Paola would probably pick up, is definitely a thing, but if you have access to the right drugs in HIV, you don't progress. You stay with HIV, you take your drugs, you see your GP, and you live a life as close to normal as you can, managing that disease very well. And I would certainly like to think that would happen in my lifetime, certainly if not before, but absolutely with time, investment and research, we will absolutely get a cure.
Okay, listen, Bart, Paola, Richard, thank you very much. Thanks to Jade and Jodie and everybody else who's chipped in through the chat and in the conversation. Just to wrap up very quickly, I mean, I think I come away from this just infused with the optimism that our 3 sort of experts have radiated. And I do think that I found the comparison with cancer, I wondered if it was a bit flip when I first made it, but actually it's quite useful. I think it helps me understand that we're dealing, that people like Bart and Paola are understanding the complexity of what we're dealing with. It helps me understand that, like cancer, there's a mix of genetic and environmental components that give me some agency within the sort of overall calculation. I think I was troubled by the funding point that Bart made at the end, because, you know, I feel for you, Bart, to put together this team on the promise of a moonshot and then find that you know, you run out of unleaded halfway to the moon that's heartbreaking and really worrying. So with that little cloud on the horizon, which I hope through events like this the government might start to address. Let me thank everybody for their contributions, and just steer you towards the next session, which starts in just 6 minutes now, which is, are we ready for the next pandemic? But for now, everybody, thank you so much.